I think we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, before we do too much, I do want to point out that at the table next to the door as you enter, there's a sign-up sheet for those of you who might need or want CEUs from this lecture. Make sure that you get all your information on that sign-up sheet, and then there's an evaluation form from the American Society of Landscape Architects, and you can go ahead and fill out one of those too. So those sign-up sheets are just for people who want CEUs or they want LACES credit for their registration. Otherwise, you don't need to sign in. It's with great pleasure that I'm welcoming John Russell back to Ball State University with his lovely partner Ingrid, who's here visiting with him. John hasn't been here for quite some time, and when you go back through his history here, it's really pretty significant. The department was started in the program was started in 1966 by John Lancy, and when it became a department, Professor John, was the department chair. He had started as chair of the program in 1974 and continued on through as the program became a department until 1980. John got his MLA from Berkeley in 1957. His classmate was Pete Walker. So you may know of the power of that school at that time and even today. He practiced from 1962 to 1970 and then returned to school in London, England, where he studied for a couple of years before coming back to Ball State and starting as a faculty member and as a chair. John's lecture today is going to be on the design process, thinking in the box, before thinking out of the box, and it's going to focus on the continuing need for students, instructors, and practitioners alike to reassess how they understand and apply the design process. I had someone tell me the other day that although we never want our designs to be replicated, we actually can replicate our design process to some degree. So it's going to be very, very interesting to hear John's talk about the full application of the design process and the way that he will let us know the deeper meanings of what we do. So please join me in welcoming John Russell, our Emeritus Professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture here at CAP.
Thank you. Thank you, Jody. Thank you. Thank you, Jody. And thank you. I'm delighted to return to the college and to this auditorium that was the center of so many different activities during my time here. Exhibits and student project juries, faculty meetings, numerous other events. In fact, we had kites one time hanging in this, as well as out in the atrium, from a renowned kite maker who lived in the area. And thank you for joining me in this continuing quest for understanding and application of design process. And welcome to those out there. I'm here at Ball State, and thank you and welcome to those out there who are involved in the webcast program of this lecture. I also want to thank Jody and Laurie Pence, assistant to the dean, and Dean Vasquez de la Valesco for their invitation and valued support. Also, I must thank dozens of students with whom I had the honor of sharing experiences and discoveries over those 25 years. Their commitment and energy helped to shape my thinking and beliefs in many profound ways. And former colleague here at Ball State, I also wish to thank, is Scott Collard, who was a valuable compatriot in discussion on design process, and some of his graphics are included here as well. Also, I would be remiss in not thanking Marilyn Davis, Administrative Assistant in Landscape Architecture, for her valuable support. I'm seeking to instill in students and educators and practitioners alike the need to keep an open mind about design process, to see the value in rethinking how one approaches the fundamental building blocks, the basics, with a new perspective. While my expertise is in landscape architecture, my message is applicable to all environmental designers and problem solvers. I wish to set the stage for the discussion on my design process model by introducing 3 points. First, a definition of design process. I see it as an ongoing cyclical endeavor in which the designer applies an array of values to identify suitable and unsuitable characteristics of various objective and subjective criteria related to a given problem that will lead to measurable and creative end results in response to defined anticipated goals. Whew. Okay. Stated another way, design process is the discovery of the who, what, where, when, and how, as well as why, of a given environmental design problem, which lead to sensitive, appropriate, responsive, creative, and inspiring design solutions. Second, some assumptions. I believe the well-prepared environmental designer brings to the process several critically important contributions. The ability to imagine the future, the ability to discover, interpret, and apply a broad array of values, the ability to resolve effectively the wide variety of scientific and technical demands associated with any given environmental design problem. The ability to apply a variety of communication tools to convey ideas that fellow consultants, clients, public officials, and the general public will understand. A deep commitment and belief in the correctness and value of one's chosen field, but without being blinded by arrogance and the unwillingness to keep an open mind. The ability to read the urban, rural, and untrammeled landscapes, a sense of place, and to read the complex human, social, and cultural systems, a sense of humanity. The willingness to become informed and knowledgeable of an ever-widening area of involvement. John Muir, author, naturalist, and co-founder of the Sierra Club, stated over 100 years ago, "When we engage ourselves in any one thing, we will find it hitched to the rest of the universe." These words still ring true today. Next on the list of assumptions is the confidence to find solutions to environmental design problems that not only resolve critical issues of sustainability, energy conservation, context, needs, and demands, but also that open up new vistas of creativity to nourish the culture. Author, artist, art critic Rollo May, in his book, The Courage to Create, discusses the importance of finding ways to overcome the fear of trusting in one's ability to stretch one's imagination and to believe that you have the right, the authority to tread into new territory, new experiences of design creativity, and a thorough understanding of the problem. Third, while I will use the singular term designer throughout my discussion today, the plural term designers and others involved in the process are included as well. In the vast majority of instances, the resolve of a problem, more likely than not, is a collaborative effort and I must add, the most satisfying. Even though I've been engaged with the issue of design process since the early 1980s, recently I was struck by what I call an epiphany of sorts, and what's inside that box that would allow one to have the ability and accountability to think outside the box. A story of quantum leaps of faith, as I call them. And during my years here at Ball State, I became increasingly alarmed by these quantum leaps of faith I encountered during design project juries. And what are quantum leaps of faith? They are the unaccountable or ignored steps associated with attempts to solve a given design problem. The dialogue goes something like this. Now, I did the inventory and analysis, and here is my solution. Sound familiar? Well, or as Henry would say, hit a bucket of balls, he buys a bucket, and he hits the bucket. Hitting the whole bucket of balls, disregarding the fundamentals of the process. Thus, in order to think outside the box, meaning to be outstanding, ultra-creative, or unique in one's problem solving, the designer must avoid the tendency to gloss over or internalize these critical steps. However, as I will repeat throughout the lecture, it is inside the box that the environmental designer first must discover and understand, then apply the foundation building blocks necessary to achieve design solutions that can inspire, that avoid those quantum leaps of faith and come up short of their potential. Design process, as I see it, is not a theory, and it is not a design style, as some have described it to me. Design process is a practical mindset based on those building blocks through which the designer can make unimaginative discoveries about him or herself, about the client and other users, about the land, about the context, about the values of the community, about the principles that guide the design process, and about the special solutions that can evolve even from the limitations or constraints associated with a given problem, because they have covered the basics. A companion story. Years ago, the great international concert pianist, Arthur Rubinstein, who was still performing regularly in his early 90s, was engaged in a televised interview. The host for the interview asked Mr. Rubinstein what he attributed to his long success. Mr. Rubinstein quickly answered, "The basics." The host replied, "What do you mean by the basics?" "The scales. I practice the scales every day since I was a 4-year-old boy." Important also is the meaning or purpose of the environmental design professions. Noted author, playwright, poet, social activist James Baldwin offers a valuable insight about the fundamental role of the artist or designer thusly. The role of the artist, then, precisely, is to illuminate that darkness, blaze roads through the vast forest, so that we will not, in all our doing, lose sight of its purpose, which is, after all, to make the world a more humane dwelling place. Important to note, as I stated earlier, the journey of discovery most often is not traveled alone. Environmental designers collaborate with a host of invaluable consultants and rely on the day-to-day experiences of average citizens, officials from public agencies and private organizations, businessmen, school teachers and their students, and many, many more. The designer cannot proceed on solid ground without taking the time to uncover, record, and understand as many personal and collective community connections as possible related to a given project site. In short, the designer cannot operate in a vacuum, devoid of the input of a large number of participants and contributors. Critical to the designer's success is discovering a sense of community. So, what are these building blocks? I have selected 10 blocks as having considerable significance upon which I will focus my attention today. An examination of these 10 building blocks will provide further insight. First, the program and project requirements. Every project must commence with a program and a set of requirements that often are developed by the client, but may also be a product of the designer and or the community, or a combination of all three. The program establishes certain distinct parameters through which the project will be developed. However, they are not cast in stone. Problem and subproblem. The designer must commence every project by asking and answering a series of essential questions. What is the purpose of this project? What is the problem? What are the subproblems? Why is this project necessary? What is the real problem or problems or larger context I am facing? This latter question often is elusive for several important reasons. For instance, the symptoms may be so glaring that they distract the designer from recognizing the real problem or problems. Or the client may lack the ability to properly describe the appropriate atmosphere, quality, or character they wish to achieve. Landscape architect James Rose wrote that the designer must learn to hear, but not hear, see, but not see what their client is trying to convey. Remember Do not confuse symptoms for problems. Limitations and constraints. Similar to problem identification and assumptions, early identification of a variety of limitations and constraints associated with a given problem will provide a reality check, enabling the designer to approach the problem with confidence and help to build an accurate basis upon which the problem must be approached. Every project has issues with time, funding, and available resources. Often there are other limitations that affect the process. Knowing the limitations can be empowering and provide a stimulus to creativity. For example, a recent TED lecture by a gentleman named Phil Hansen, a young artist with, unfortunately, a debilitating shake in his right hand, right arm. And this program you can find on TED, if you haven't looked up TED Talks on your computer. On public radio, you can find TED Weekends in Bloomington at 4 o'clock on NPR. They're very enlightening. There's a whole series of TED Talks on YouTube, and I would encourage you to look into them. But this young gentleman, Mr. Hansen, provides a very interesting story. He became frustrated as a designer, and especially he had problems with his physical capabilities. But he found a job outside of his art, became comfortable financially, and so he went out and he bought all kinds of art things, pencils and drawing papers, whatever. And he was loaded with all of this equipment. And he said, it was paralyzing. He said, I had so many options with all of this wonderful stuff that I had bought. I didn't know what to do with it. So he made this wonderful thought. He said, I need to get back into the box before I really can get out of the box. And I just delighted when I ran into that because it was what I had been thinking as well. So what he did was go back into the box and realize that his shaking arm was not a liability. It actually increased what he called the ultimate liberation. He indicated, I had quit trying so hard, thinking outside the box, and to get back into the box. What I thought would be the ultimate limitation turned out to be the ultimate liberation. And you should look at that particular TED Talk with Mr. Hansen. It's called Embrace the Shake. And you'll see what he did with his limitations. It's wonderful. Assumptions. You can't progress without making some assumptions. Assumptions, again, assist the designer to place the project into yet another level of reality, to help get one's thinking off the ground, until further discoveries begin to fill those gaps. Now, this is the next area I am particularly concerned with, and that is that we understand the whole array of values with which the designer must contend in any given project. And they come in these many forms. It's a wide spectrum of values that come into play on any given project. The client and the users have values. The designer has his own values that he or she brings to the design table. The community has values, codes, ordinances, policies, decisions made by planning departments, planning commissions, mayors, councils, scientific values. We're bombarded with a variety of those. Professional ASLA has values. AIA has values. AIPA has values. Professional and state regulatory values. Ian McHarg, in his book Design with Nature, published in 1969, probably has come as close as anyone that I have come across in addressing the full range of consideration for values. In one chapter in his book, entitled Response to Values, McHarg identifies his method as not being a plan, but a strategy which can support varied plans depending upon collective and individual decisions. Physiographic features have social values, states McHarg, and he concludes by commenting, moreover, this method permits a most important improvement in the planning method. That is, the community can employ its own value system. Goals. Every design problem will generate a set of goals which determine the direction in which the project is headed. Remember, goals are measurable end results the designer, the community, the client wish to achieve. The operative word here is measurable. A goal relates to change. A goal can be tested for its effectiveness by applying various statistical, social, and physical measurements. Important also to remember, don't confuse goals with tasks. I might diverge on that one a little bit because I think it's part of the language that we use. There's a great book by Lakoff and Johnson called The Metaphors We Live By. And if you can find that one somewhere, it's an old publication, but it has some very insightful thoughts. And what I'm referring here is that often we talk about things to do, action, and we make those appear to be goals, but they're not measurable. They're simply what we want to do to achieve an end result and to reach that level that can be measurable, something that's increased and or has changed or has provided new opportunity that wasn't there before that you identified. Okay. Inventory. Too often, the environmental designer focuses only on the objective inventory, the natural systems, the existing built form, from the infrastructure, the utilities, etc., ignoring a large range of topics that are part of the dynamics of any site. Thus, the full measure of immersion into the project site will occur when the designer broadens his or her considerations. Subjective inventory, such items as special views or areas of significant geologic outcropping, or social inventory, how people react to different environments for the interest to preserve sites or buildings or neighborhoods of significant historic value, or cultural inventory, how people of different age and backgrounds use different environments, or psychological inventory, individual collective reverence or rejection of specific qualities of cityscape, landscape, or wilderness. One example, following World War II, the British government enacted sweeping national planning legislation that would reshape the nation. One piece of legislation was the New Towns Act of 1946. Some 33 areas in England, Scotland, and Wales were designated for the development of new towns or expanded small towns. These new towns were planned to house residents, primarily working-age men and women. Over 1.2 million residents from war-torn and designated substandard inner-city areas of London, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and other metropolitan areas were required to leave the inner-city neighborhoods. This was a massive social family disconnect, and it was created when citizens from different social backgrounds were brought together, completely devoid of the social network that gave them security, love, family, old friends at the local pub, and many other aspects of daily life, which they had enjoyed back in the inner city. Several generations of Newtowners have had to evolve to help overcome this disconnect, but at a heavy price. And these are what war-torn, bombed-out London, and an image of the Newtown inner city shopping district, and a master plan for one of the early new towns north of London. Design principles. They represent the values or ethic or standards upon which the design of a given project is based. They emerge from a conscious effort to define exactly what values or ethic will guide the overall direction of the project. They are an amalgam of the values noted earlier and from certain valued characteristics of a given site. Some examples. No development shall occur on prime agricultural land, or the historic significance of the neighborhood shall be recognized and preserved, and there's so many others. Evaluation or analysis, as it often is called, I believe the use of the term evaluation is more accurate than analysis. From several sources I have read, analysis is defined as breaking down into something into parts in order to study and document. Whereas evaluation, with the term value in the center of it, is defined as fixing the value or worth of something. Evaluation is defined inasmuch as the design process is dealing with both the discovery and application of values or constituents and inventory elements. The term evaluation would appear to be more appropriate. Evaluation methods to document and apply the various natural systems and human forces of a given site have gone through a fascinating evaluation and evolution. The top photo in the British Army in the late 1700s relied on highly detailed survey maps. And there's a wonderful article in the National Geographic that talks about that particular map being the base upon which a study was made of what Manhattan Island looked like before 1609, when it was discovered. And it's a fascinating resurrection of the original Manhattan Island. But they use various symbols in here. All of these were various kind of crude symbols that the British Army had established to, don't tell me, to actually for troop deployment and artillery placement in 1785, because they were still fighting the Yankees. And this kind of rough but advancing process of marking the inventory of a site continued and evolved, and even Greensward, the wonderful plan that Olmsted and Vaux came up with in 1863 for the master plan for Central Park, had its part of that evolution. Of course, that evolution has gone from the hand-drawn numerical grid maps to the first computer-driven geographic information system established in Canada by transplanted Englishman Roger Tomlinson in 1962. And sadly, Mr. Tomlinson just passed away this past February, a very elderly gentleman who contributed enormously to the process that we now take for granted. And granted, there have been many other advances in computer-generated GIS methods, which post-date Ian McHarg's physiographic determinism method. However, the historic timing of this application I will use as an example for developing a system to identify suitable and unsuitable areas for specific land uses. And so McHarg applied shades of color or shades of black to gray to white, and which gave emphasis on suitabilities and unsuitable issues. Curiously, this particular study, which was conducted in the late 1960s, had a strange familiarity to it when the required evacuation plan was developed by the City of New York for Staten Island, which is almost comparable. I won't get near this. You can see the dark shades were unsuitable for urbanization. And the Hurricane Sandy required evacuation is almost a duplicate of it. 1969 to 2012. So this is it's an interesting comparison. A friend of a friend of a friend remembered this study and sent it to his friend, and his friend sent it to, in fact, Tom Church, who used to teach here. And Tom sent it to me and said, "Hey, what do you think? McHarg had something right." And it was an incredible study. And unfortunately, people were right in the face of Hurricane Sandy, which left the place a mess. Okay. Another critical point is what I call the reevaluation steps of this process. The application of the value systems does not evolve without considerable investigation, discovery, understanding, and interpretation on the part of the designer to avoid those quantum leaps of faith mentioned earlier. When making value judgments about the various resources uncovered during the process, I view the process functioning like a series of yin-yang bubbles, and I call it the action module. And it moves forward, but it's also moving backwards. It's reevaluating. So you have your criteria where your basic elements that I have been talking about, program, assumptions, constraints, and then your action where you go through the various methods of evaluation and inventory, and you come out of that knowing more about the program, more about the project site, and it goes on to generation and next generation, but it's also, you have that opportunity to move backward and to reassess the original principles or the original goals and restate them. And I think this is a step that we often overlook. We quickly jump from here to here, the leaps of faith that I've been talking about. And we need to stop in that process and rethink where we've traveled and what we've learned and how that affects what got us going in the first place, and make some readjustments. Important to note, the process may commence anywhere. We can start out here with an idea, but unless we go back into the box and we understand those fundamentals, the basics, and then work our way back through, we're going to miss out, I believe, on some very important points that create nothing. It creates something short of what we could possibly create. The process, of course, at the end of the project doesn't end there. Important for the designer is to mount a post-construction evaluation of the completed project to understand how well the project responds to the stated goals and how improvements can be made that will affect the next project. So it's that last yin-yang bubble out there where you are looking at the project, you had a set of requirements, and you reassess, did I meet that goal? There's some wonderful post-construction work published over the years, and I would recommend looking into that. A reflection. As you heard last week from Jose Alenanya from Andropogan Associates, every project site has its own specific ecology. Thus, whether the project is a small interior court, a downtown streetscape, or a regional landscape feasibility study, one will discover this array of natural forces, which we've talked about, climate, microclimate, soils, geology, hydrology, vegetation, wildlife, topography, etc., that will require documentation and evaluation for the suitable and unsuitable characteristics associated with the various types of land uses. They will play a critical role in guiding the direction of the project, and this discovery starts inside that box. Over my time associated with landscape architecture, commencing in 1952, I have witnessed enormous changes in how the professions have responded to the forces of nature and the essential need to design projects that embrace the issues of energy conservation and sustainability. This new awareness has led to the leadership in energy and environmental design, LEED policies and guidelines, championed by the American Institute of Architects, and the Sustainable Sites Initiative, SSI, promoted by the American Society of Landscape Architects in partnership with others. I'm deeply encouraged by this growing insight about the value and forces of nature. This expanded discovery of the forces of natural systems has added a new level of understanding for this sense of place. Mastering the landscape, the design process does not come overnight or simply by listening to my lecture or from a diversity of books, professional journals, or papers. Essentially, design is a lifelong pursuit and requires a willingness to explore, experiment, and test new and old ways of looking at the landscape, at the urban cityscape, at rural and wild environments, and embracing related fields, as I noted earlier. This pursuit is an exciting and exacting adventure. I believe very deeply that none of these achievements will occur without embracing first a deep immersion and understanding of the land, second, a deep understanding of the human condition, affecting and affected by one's involvement, and third, by embracing the basics of the design process. The story really never ends. The research and discovery goes around and around like the action module I was talking about, ever moving forward, but ever looking backward to reevaluate, to commence another generation of discovery in the constant pursuit of greater clarity and inspiring design solutions. When these fundamental building blocks have been identified and thoroughly addressed, then the environmental designer possesses the potential, skills, and understanding to step outside the box, to explore new avenues of one's creativity. I will close with a segment from an insightful essay written by N. Scott Momaday, author, teacher, environmentalist, and Native American, entitled American Land Ethic. And this was found in a Sierra Club handbook called Eco-Tactics, published over 40 years ago. Professor Momaday expresses his feelings about the land. Once in his life, man ought to concentrate his mind upon the remembered earth, I believe. He ought to give himself up to a particular landscape in his experience, to look at it from as many angles as he can, to wonder about it, to dwell upon it. He ought to imagine that he touches it with his hands at every season and listens to the sounds that are made upon it. He ought to imagine creatures there and all the fainted motions of the wind. He ought to recollect the glare of noon and all the colors of the dawn and dusk. Mamadei continues, I am interested in the way that a man looks at a given landscape and takes possession of it in his blood and in his brain. None of us lives apart from the land entirely. Such an isolation is unimaginable. And we must come to moral terms. There is no alternative, I believe, if we are to realize and maintain our humanity. For our humanity must consist in part in the ethical as well as in the practical ideal of preservation. We Americans need no more than ever before, and indeed more than we know, to imagine who and what we are with respect to the earth and the sky. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. Very inspiring. So, you up for some questions?
Well, if there are a couple of questions.
If there are a couple
That's about
questions.
all I have energy for.
Anybody have a question for Professor Russell? That was quite a lot. Simon?
Yes.
Thanks, John. Could you perhaps tell us some of the changes that you've seen since you began teaching in the studio environment, and then give us some insight from your perspective on some things we could do to engage younger students to returning to fundamentals?
Okay. But I don't walk on water. Oh, that's a big question. So what I have observed in the profession over time and how it has changed in studio. I think some of the points I made today, as I mentioned, was from my experience over time in the studio, seeing these huge quantum leaps of faith. And I think it was a fellow that came from Illinois. What was it, Don Walker? Are you, Bob? Was that right? Yeah. I think Don came here on sabbatical for a semester or a couple of quarters in those days. And he was very irritated when he saw these quantum leaps of faith. And I remember how agitated in one particular jury that he saw all this beautiful effort made at soils, topography, vegetation, water, blah, 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 and that went across. And then suddenly here was a design solution over here. And there wasn't the input from the student to recognize that there had to be applied to all that incredible amount of effort made in collecting information and documenting it, but then what do you do with it? And I think that was part of the problem that I've seen it in the profession. I saw it in my own practice. I realized later that there were some very important steps, some very important insights that we kind of gloss over. Or we become so familiar practicing that we internalize all of this. And a lot of that comes from making prejudgments about where we're wanting to go without really knowing where we've come from. And I think that's really critical for students to understand where are they coming from. What are the set of basic understandings that they have about a problem? And they have to embrace that project, the problem statement. And I think that's where maybe we should have students become more psychologically involved in the problem itself. I know Sonny Palmer, who was a great guy to teach with, and sadly is no longer here. Sonny and I taught a course for those advanced first-year students who had another degree or advanced undergraduate studies in the summer. And one of the things we tried to do in our Johnsonia, which was the imaginary community that we developed, was to have the students take ownership of that project and to provide their own input on aspects of Johnsonia. We want you to tell us, what kind of social culture is what was the history, how do people use Johnsonia? And we had them do that with a series of projects. And I think it was a way of having the student really embrace that problem and to get involved emotionally in it, to buy into it, and to learn from their colleagues who all had their interpretation of it. And I think we need to have more of that kind of involvement from the student in a given project. I thought it was a wonderful experience. I think I was just talking for a few minutes with some of the students in Bob Benson's studio, and the question came up on an important aspect of landscape architecture in this case, but it applies to all of the disciplines. And that was the idea of understanding the human element, how people of various ages, walks of life, get involved in a given space. How do they relate to it? Is there something cultural that is involved? Or what is it that older people versus younger people, how do they react differently? And I think we need to really understand that more than I think we do. Realize there are 1,500 other items that we ought to know with greater depth as students and as faculty, as practitioners. Well, I think those are two things that kind of stand out in my mind. Anything else? Anyone wants to?
Anybody else?
Okay.
Question?
Sorry for the technical glitch, but gosh,
we'll never invite you here again.
Gosh, isn't that what happens with technology?
John, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.